What you're watching is the video game Dwarf Fortress. But believe it or not, there isn't a single dwarf in this gameplay. These are all vampires. And while I know they're technically dwarven vampires, I don't need you to actually me. Because they play so differently than a normal dwarf, they might as well be a different species. That means they don't need to sleep, eat, or drink. Well, except for blood. They're also immortal and never get tired, which is a pain because those are all things that make a dwarf happy. A nice bedroom, a good night's sleep, food and drink, and leisure time are all things that vampires tend to give up because they're just simply not things that they need. And just like how we neglect ourselves in real life if we think we don't need something, so do the dwarves. Especially vampire dwarves. And yes, that's a giant erupting volcano. In this video, I'm going to go into detail of how I did this, what it's like to manage these dwarves, and how this fortress came to be. This is the fortress of Wintherthrone. In order to tell its story, we have to go back in time, to before this fortress was even founded, to a fortress called Winterhearth. This is the tale of how my fortress was taken over by vampires, or how I let them take over. And in doing so, I damned the fortress to insanity, and the world to inevitable destruction by those who seek the taste of blood. Our humble tale begins in a small fortress. It goes by the name of Winterhearth. The dwarves that live here focus on building exotic armor for interesting creatures, on special requests, of course. The fortress is currently preparing suits of armor for several curious adventurers, who we will shortly run into. But for now, the fortress is bustling. It exists on a cold glacier in the middle of the Great South Flats, surrounded by ice. The dwarves have built their homes on the surface of the ice and tunneled down to the local cave systems to begin harvesting materials for their forges. After the initial fortress setup, the dwarves put together a pump stack, bringing lava from the magma sea up to the surface, causing a lot of water to melt in the ice, but also allowing them to have a consistent and good way to produce their materials. This was also an experiment by the dwarves, to see how plausible it would be to survive on a glacier that's actively being melted by lava, because the mountain home had their sights set on a new location that Winterhearth would be the basis of. Winterhearth is the great forges, forging weapons and armor for the dwarves that were going to settle in Wintherthrone, their future mountain home, just a mere day's travel to the east. But Winterhearth, as peaceful as it seemed on the surface, was about to embrace calamity. While conducting one of many experiments, the expedition leader, Ebenezer, wasn't paying much attention to who was visiting their tavern. And as the dwarves were finishing up the final touches on their pump stack to begin pumping the lava from the lava sea, cries echoed from the town center. The full moon had risen, and even though it was hidden by a thick layer of snowy clouds, it didn't change the fact that one of their visitors had become a werepanda. Many of their visitors uttered their final breaths as they bled out on the surface after the fight had finished. This was a very grim tiding, as there was many injured still residing in the tavern. And after a brief discussion with the militia commander and the horrors that she faced, the fortress was taking a turn for the worst. But they had a mission to complete, and the trading caravan had just arrived, so they did what they had to do. They locked the doors of the tavern and prayed to their gods that everyone who had been converted would be locked safely inside. The dwarves of Winterhearth offered a gold amulet as a gift, a symbol implying that they had completed their mission, and their armor and weapons were now ready for the mountain home to embark on Wintherthrone. But this silence and small victories wouldn't last for very long, for the chants and songs from the tavern became exasperated, and the screams began once again. Inside, another dwarf had turned, and many more of the tavern's occupants had been infected. But Ebenezer, the expedition leader, was trying to keep things positive, spending his time in the Armorsmiths Guild, trying to keep things organized. But as if things couldn't get worse, word came from the caverns the monster slayers had found something, a great beast who sprayed deadly dust. They called the creature Filthsucker, and it paralyzed all in its wake. Several brave hunters who'd been spending time in the fortress thought this was their chance at glory. Perhaps it was, if any of them actually had the talent to kill the thing. Fortunately, the dwarves had built the forges further down, out of reach of such a creature, but it was still a concern, and so the dwarves took some of their prized weapons and equipped them. As the thunderous cracks of the creature's fighting echoed through the caves, and the final monster hunter fell. The dwarves decided the only way forward was to simply lock the caves and make sure the creature did not have access, because their real concerns were on the surface. The full moon was about to rise once more, and chaos erupted in the tavern. The only positive takeaway for the dwarves was that all of the infected were in fact sealed. However, this was not good for anybody who had friends here, or for any of the visitors who'd been spending time here. Dark days were becoming a constant normality in Wintherthrone, and they didn't even have the comedic relief of Jack Black, just simply the roaring thunder and infectious disease of lycanthropy. Aside from the calamities, the fortress had been largely successful. The dwarves had experimented with their surface lava, and the mountain home was pleased, at least in the one message they'd received. And at the very least, they had less mouths to feed. But the dwarves made a fatal error. They'd presumed that, like most lycanthropes, they could catch them in a cage. And since, based on the voices they could hear through the walls, there was only one left alive. However, because this creature was a citizen and not a hostile entity, when the full moon rose once more, the dwarf already knew there was a cage trap waiting, and skillfully skipped over top of it. This was the final straw for Wintherthrone in many ways. The dwarves gathered round, trying to end the creature with whatever they could find. Wintherthrone was a forge, and not a barracks. But yesterday is history, tomorrow is a mystery, and today is a gift, and that's why it's called the present. But going forward, the few remaining dwarves of Wintherthrone would lock themselves indoors, hiding from the thunderous roars of the fearsome panda. Just a few days' travel to the north, a small band of adventurers was gathering. They'd received word that they were to head towards the great volcano that had been recently settled on by 7 dwarves. This volcano had been named Wintherthrone, right next to the Great Hearth, the legendary forge. The party got their things together and made their way outside of town, heading south. Before they could join the dwarves in Wintherthrone, they had to make a stop at Winterhearth. For such an unusual band of creatures, weapons and armor were not easy to come by, and the mountain home had placed an order specifically intended for these adventurers. But as they neared their destination, it became quickly apparent that something horrible had happened. Plumes of smoke were rising from a crater in front of the fortress. The brave party of adventurers then noticed camps and signs of an army. Winterhearth was under siege. At that moment, they made the decision to disobey the mountain home's orders and instead proceed directly to Wintherthrone. It wouldn't take long before they had arrived at their destination, and they introduced themselves to the starting 7, who'd only just finished unpacking. And as the first week began to pass, they heard a rumbling, a great sound, as if they were being punished by the gods. The volcano of Wintherthrone had began erupting. This is the story of the rise and fall of Wintherthrone, and its history preserved in the great engravings along the blood-stained walls. Gather round, dwarves, and grab a glass, for the tale of Wintherthrone is like no other. Many lessons can be learned from the tales of this great fortress. Before we delve any deeper, I think there's a citation needed here. I'm actually abusing a bug that has since been patched. So what happened was I found the location for this embark. Then I embarked and had 7 dwarves. Once completing the embark, naming the fortress and everything, I retired it. This allowed me to create an adventurer party and then walk those adventurers to this fortress. Once I completed that process, I then retired the adventurers in that location and reclaimed the fortress so that I could play it again in fortress mode. I know I said the word fortress too many times in that sentence, but bear with me. Once I've reclaimed the fortress, all of the adventurers are now hanging out and existing in this location, known as Wintherthrone. However, the bug that has since been fixed is now the fortress is listed as a capital. Previously, if you'd retire and reclaim a fortress, it would always list you as the capital for some reason, making it almost impossible to actually get the king and queen to migrate to the fortress. The second effect that this bug had on the fortress is that the volcano began erupting. Now, the reason for this eruption was the game didn't know what level to fill the lava to, and it presumed 2 levels above where the volcano was originally placed. This has since been fixed, but was a bug I actually quite liked in some situations, giving the neat effect of the volcano erupting. Of course, you could do this still by simply digging through the surface of the volcano, but I liked the kind of unexpected calamity of the eruptions. The final effect that this bug has upon reclaiming the fortress, and I'm not sure if this one still happens, is it exposed one of the cavern layers, as well as the magma sea, because the volcano goes all the way down to the bottom, where the lava is. And then a tube, which could have formed into a volcano, went up to where the 3rd cavern layer is. The result is the game presumes that the dwarves have access to these spaces, even though they most assuredly do not. But honestly, I'll take it, because now the volcano is erupting, and there's a whole lot of notifications of things collapsing. And this clicking sound, which I will mute for your sanity, is getting really annoying. But no matter, we've got dwarves to introduce. The adventurers all have these nifty little golden outlines, which I've never noticed before. And the dwarves themselves are run by Moses, who's our expedition leader, who spoke with a friend and feels fond, but is annoyed at the snowstorm. Frankly, I don't blame him. I would be more annoyed and concerned with the constant clicking sound from the overflowing lava creating obsidian, which is constantly falling. This got so annoying, in fact, that I quickly turned it off. Fascinatingly enough, the lava was starting to form rivers, and was going in pretty predictable directions. And concerningly, it seems to be headed directly towards my 7 dwarves and 10 adventurers. Well, time to panic, let's start digging. Thankfully, I have some extra hands who can help with pickaxes, and extra hands to help make bricks, because we're gonna need to wall this lava off, most likely, so that it doesn't melt away the ice in front of my wagon. I would like to have an entrance and exit, after all. As cool as this is looking, it is quite catastrophic. Thankfully, work has been quite efficient, and the bricks are already getting placed, in the nick of time even. You may also notice some wood logs. We brought those with during our initial embark. I thought they might be useful considering there's no wood that grows here. And interestingly enough, the flow of the lava is actually blocking its own way, meaning shelves are forming of pure obsidian. This is actually getting kind of fascinating to look at. It keeps directing itself, creating lava flows and riverbeds. It's actually quite fascinating to watch. It's gonna make this place look awesome eventually. However, I'm starting to think I will never be able to re-enable the something has collapsed notification because it's still going. It looks like it's a couple 100 times per minute. Thankfully, I don't need to listen to it. And with the front entrance walled off and things seemingly stabilizing, we can start working on farming and places to store seeds. And the front entry hall. Fortunately or unfortunately, because some of the cavern layers have been exposed, thanks to the game thinking that I have access to them, we get to witness this monstrosity appear on the map. Githa M has come, an enormous quadruped composed of blue diamond. It has a knobby trunk and it squirms and fidgets. Beware its webs. Well, that is horrifying. I guess you just live down there now. Enjoy the caverns, beast. They're yours forever, probably. Where was I? Right. We began making mugs and various other crafts for the dwarves, stuff that we knew that we would need early on. We also took advantage of the already appointed manager. In between the embarks, it seems the dwarves were pretty busy and appointed the necessary nobles before we had time to even arrive. And the fortress was beginning to take shape. We were rapidly approaching the time for trading, and thankfully the merchant caravan actually had a way onto the map. I was very worried they would just randomly combust for some strange reason. I'm not sure why. Maybe I'll figure it out eventually, it was just kind of a hunch that I had. So I began preparing the necessary trade goods for bartering. But shortly after the dwarves arrived and began unloading their goods, they dumped most of what they had brought, and then began running around in fear, and I wasn't entirely sure what was causing this, until I realized. It appears that the soldiers really don't like my giant cheetahs. It's likely due to the fact that they were currently aligned with a human faction that I brought my adventurers from. This meant that they were technically hostile with any of my neutral entities, which didn't end well for the poor cheetah. After cutting it to pieces, the merchants and their soldiers left. The only good news from this was that we were actually able to butcher it. The bad news is I was one cheetah down, and in order to trade in the future, I would have to quarantine the cheetahs. This also meant that my reputation with my home faction would drop considerably, and they would bring a lot less in the following trade year. Good news is they also left all of their stuff, so we got a bunch of free food out of the deal. It's a shame, though. I guess we shall prepare the corpse pile. The dwarves didn't seem to mind too much. In fact, they'd already began singing and dancing. It appears that the favorite form of music for these dwarves is the Poet of Sparkling, which is a form of music that originated in the Confederations of Mansions, which is that human civ that we are at war with, that a lot of my adventurers were a part of. Fascinating, they've already brought in their culture, and they're teaching it to my dwarves, or At least trying to. Right now, they're mostly singing amongst themselves. The dwarves didn't really have a proper tavern yet, so I was gonna have to build one. Some of my adventurers were also given proper roles in the fortress. This is Sana, the fortress bug, the beetlebone doctor. We figured that her front claws would be particularly useful for setting bones, or removing unnecessary ones. The calamity with the trade caravan didn't seem to stop the migrants, and the fortress continued to expand. Because I was concerned with the problems that I had at the previous small fortress, I made a Kung Fu Panda detection device. It's very simple. Simply build a small shed with a rope in the middle, fortify the edges so that line of sight can pass through, and then just put the loudest piece of livestock in that room, and give them a punny name. This, of course, is a goose. A good old ordinary sensor emitter. Pro tip, if you have something that can be trained for hunting, it actually doubles their line of sight. Most creatures have a line of sight of 30 tiles, in kind of a sphere shape, but if they're trained for hunting, they have a line of sight of 60. I just wasn't quite willing to give up some of my dogs for this. This will now officially automatically reveal any stealthed items, including Kung Fu Pandas, or whatever else may emerge from the wilds. Thanks to the rising population, we now desperately needed bedrooms. I think I went a little bit overboard with this design, but I really like the result. The idea here is to have a circle of bedrooms with temples and guild halls and various other workshops in the middle, making very multi-purpose kind of spaces. I really like the final effect. We also built up a small military because I figured I would likely need to defend myself from something eventually, although the first threat that would come into the fortress and actively begin attacking us wasn't something that I expected. And seems that this construction is taking a while. Almost a year has gone by, and we've got another round of migrants. Well, I'm sure they'll make themselves at home. Not like we have enough beds yet. I was also positive I was going to need lava for something, so I was working on some reservoirs to hold lava when unfortunately a dwarf went berserk. This one apparently wanted silk. I did not have anything of the sort in the fort, so unfortunately the dwarf passed prematurely. Certainly not the sort of thing you'd like to see happen. And at this moment, the unexpected threat began to emerge. No, not the berserk dwarf who just died and then caused half my dwarves to get thrown into the hospital. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the great unexpected threat. This mountain goat. Apparently there was wild mountain goats in this map, and they really wanted to absolutely destroy my fortress. Frankly, I don't blame them. I would too. They kept invading me, to the point where I had to set up patrols to stop them from getting into my tunnels. I have to fill these up with lava already. And for that dead dwarf, I knew I had to start building a series of tombs, and I wanted something that fit the grim atmosphere of this fortress. Between the dead goats and losing the first artifact, I started digging more trenches for lava, and figured I would have a cool little lava flow going through my tombs. Now, I unintentionally made this into an upside-down cross. I was originally expecting to make it split and be a much wider design. However, somebody in one of my chats, I can't remember which, got so offended at the upside-down cross in this fort, which I swear I did unintentionally, that I figured I would simply theme the entire fort around upside-down crosses. Because spite, mostly. Once the design was ready, I had a dwarf chisel into the side of the volcano, and I just crossed my fingers and hoped that it wouldn't overflow and flood the fortress. I did build a bunch of safety diagonals which reset all pressure in case it tries to bubble up. This will stop it. And unfortunately, those dwarves are still in that hospital, so I need a supply of water. To remedy this, I dug down to the first cavern layer, and thankfully it had a source of water, as well as an actual supply of wood. Checking in with our diamond friend in the basement, it appears he's been rather busy. Well, good for you, keeping my caverns clean. Please don't hurt me. As I was listening to its thunderous roars, Amethyst, the gem cutter, has created Olbok Shahik, an amethyst amulet. How fitting for our first completed artifact. I think I'm going to give this beautiful specimen as a gift to my chief medical dwarf who has been working overtime since I messed up the last artifact. Enjoy your new necklace, dwarfy. And meanwhile, down below, some excitement that I almost missed, another forgotten beast decided it would be wise to attack the great blue diamond. It didn't really do much of note, and just kind of ran in and tried to fight. It did shoot some globs of goo at it, but most of them missed. It got webbed pretty effectively, and then gored to death. Because the big advantage that the diamond beast has is it has no blood, so it can't bleed out. Cuts and wounds don't actually cause it to slowly die over time. It also can't get tired, unlike other forgotten beasts that are made of fleshy stuff. So, an easy victory, I say, for our diamond champion. May your reign of terror continue. Please don't hurt me. But beasts aside, we were still getting behind on bedrooms, and I really needed to get that lava reservoir up and running. Within a few months, I'd started minting my first temples. These, of course, were nestled into the bedroom nooks, if you will. And of course, we would need more. The fortress must grow. And as the dwarves were enthusiastically mining, a commotion struck. Upon further investigation, it seems that someone tried to paint the floor with their blood, courtesy of this crocodile. One dwarf had been found dead, and another, Amethyst, who just created that artifact, was bleeding out. Well, it's a good thing it was donated to the doctor. Perhaps they'll give you priority treatment. The dwarves did quickly deal with the crocodiles, beating the crap out of them. Fortunately, one of the dwarves even had an axe, and hacked the crocodile in the head, sending the injured part asunder. Perhaps at some point I should properly renovate this hospital so that it actually does its job correctly, but I think the tavern's a bigger priority at this point, and of course we're gonna need more coffins. Best get to work. Moods had fluctuated downwards a little bit after the death of a dwarf in the middle of everybody, and then a second death that a lot of dwarves witnessed in the caves. Even my adventurers were having a bit of a downward turn in their mood. It's hard to keep them happy initially because they don't get to participate in the fortress as normal citizens for about a year and a half, sometimes two. It depends on when they ask to join properly as citizens. Until then, they don't use bedrooms and can't be assigned to the military, so there's some needs that can't be satisfied. But on the bright side, the public spaces in the bedrooms were coming along, so hopefully that would offset the negative mood a little bit. And if they get a bit rambunctious and their moods get too poor, then we can just simply put them into this fresh lava reservoir that we are now constructing. Otherwise, simply stand around and enjoy the statues and dining halls, or feel the fire. The dwarves had also elected a mayor due to the population increases, and I'm sure they were demanding a bedroom for themselves, as well as an office amongst other things, and probably also quite upset due to the lack of bedrooms for other dwarves. I guess we'll get to work on setting up the proper quarters for the mayor, as well as expanding my crafting. We're gonna need clothes soon. I was being very picky with this fortress and making sure to keep everything paved and looking nice. All in all, it was shaping up to be one of my favorite looking forts I'd made in a really long time. In short, I was just being really careful to keep the aesthetics consistent. And while those constructions were moving along, so was the new lava reservoir, prepped and ready for glass and annoying citizen cooking. And our lava moving plans weren't even putting a dent in the continuous lava flows, which was continuing to reroute itself. I constructed an additional hallway for pumping lava out of the reservoir, and started working on a surface platform which would hold wooden windmills for power generation, to power all of the lava pumps, which I was making out of glass. And remember this? Yeah, that wonderful sound that you've definitely not been hearing this whole time. I may have it muted in-game, but the alerts are still going off, just so that I can keep track of when the lava is collapsing. And as I moved to clear a series of notifications, I spotted this. Horrible news. One of my leopard people, adventurers, had been found dead, completely drained of blood. Somewhere, somehow, a vampire had migrated to the fortress. So I immediately suspected the mayor, as one does. Realistically though, it could be anybody in the fortress. So it's now time to begin the quest of, how the heck do you catch a vampire? Well, one of the first things we have to do is appoint a captain of the guard, and of course get those bodies buried. The captain of the guard needs an office, and a dining room, and a prison, with chains or cages in it. The pump project was coming along well, and hopefully the captain of the guard's office would soon have heated flooring, and the canals were beginning to fill. As for our selection, we chose the dwarf Dominok as our captain of the guard, alongside of their spouse, Onuul, Paper Tips. Dominok was the only dwarf who seemed to have the right personality for such a task. Sometimes cruel, brave, and valued the law, and immediately got to work interrogating dwarves in the tavern. But the first few interrogation attempts led to absolutely no positive results. I should note that I could absolutely do this the cheesy way. That is, simply knock down a bunch of walls and put a dormitory in the middle and lock all the dwarves in there, and the first one to get eaten is obviously getting eaten by the vampire, and then everybody will witness it. But I wanted to do this the proper way, by interrogating everybody. Vampires don't need to sleep, eat, or drink, as I explained at the beginning of the video. So if we spot a dwarf who's not drinking, that's definitely suspicious. They also tend to lie about their age, so we have to keep an eye out for dwarves with gray hair, or perhaps dwarves with abnormally high skills for a young age. But the first few interrogations led minimal results. Some dwarves seemed mildly suspicious, but came up blank. I kept checking different dwarves to see if I could find one that seemed like perhaps they were the culprit. My mayor, as an example, saw Tosid die, who some of you may remember as the dwarf who went berserk before, so that wasn't a useful lead for us. So we moved on and continued to interrogate, but unfortunately things were about to get a lot more difficult. Some more migrants had arrived, meaning the population was now beginning to climb. Dominok still had many interrogations left of the initial list, and it was about to get higher. Good news is we were about to get another artifact. Hopefully that would lift the spirits of this grim place up. For who knew that the biggest threat to the dwarves was the dwarves themselves? But I must pause for a moment, for the dwarves have made a new artifact. Kosoth, the engraver, has created Sidlaz, a tetrahedrite ring, a great treasure, and they've claimed it as an heirloom. We shall place it in the new safe that is currently under construction for safekeeping, alongside of the primordial amulets, which my adventurers brought with them. And the interrogations continue. After 2 full seasons of interrogating just about every one of the original dwarves in the fortress, we finally made progress. A dwarf by the name of Solon, a bowyer by trade, confessed to the murder, and in fact revealed that Solon was an assumed identity. Their true name was Burr, Fortress Cross. They also admitted that in the year 177, they began embezzling funds. So not only were they a murderer and the vampire that we were searching for, they were also a financial white-collar criminal. Absolutely shameful that you call yourself a dwarf, vampire. It looks like they arrived in the fortress in the year 306, and had been quite grouchy since arriving, and they found their life to be rather uneventful. I'm not sure how you could find this place uneventful with the eruptions and all. And the crazy thing that I'd like to point out is, even though this dwarf has been around for a while, they didn't even find murdering my own dwarf to be horrifying or even mildly upsetting. Looking through their recent thought, they're just mildly bored at their unexciting life. They do seem bothered by the goblin that they witnessed die, but that goblin was simply some criminal who was trying to kidnap our children. Frankly, no dwarf should be even remotely disturbed by this. Yet the practice of literally consuming one of my dwarves doesn't seem to bother him. What a criminal. Using the nicknaming ability within Dwarf Fortress, we can see their true name revealed when I select it, and I gave them the custom role of vampire, so they were easier to track down. And frankly, there was no better time than this than to convict them of their crimes, at least after I interrogated him several more times, both for the purpose of practicing interrogation and also for the practical reasoning of making sure that he doesn't escape as we try to lock him up. And as I clicked the convict button, something horrifying happened. The were-lizard Bathe has come, a large lizard twisted into humanoid form. It was crazed for blood and flesh, and its eyes glowed azure. Its sepia scales were jagged and overlapping. Well, that's terrifying. It seems that my goose has failed me, because the lizard was already inside. In the goose's defense, I think the lizard came from a different angle. Must have come from the east instead of the west. But still, the goose should have seen that. I'm docking your pay by 15 kibble pellets, you silly goose. As for the dwarves, thankfully they were decent at dodging, and only one dwarf ended up getting bit. And the creature managed to collapse, and was eventually bested by the dwarves. As for the dwarf that got bit, well, they'll make for a pretty good vampire snack. I'm sure he'll get thirsty while in prison. And during the commotion, the captain of the guard and his wife locked up the vampire. The captain of the guard's wife had recently been appointed as hammerer. This made it into sort of a family business, which I kind of liked the concept of. Also seems that the dwarves finally found religion, and a portion of the fortress population was worshipping gods associated with the granite denomination. So we had to build them a temple. Thankfully, we had plenty of space for them. And remember the were-creature? Well, I decided that it would be smart to simply put them in this cell in the prison. I actually had to set the prison as a hospital to do this. Once the dwarf was placed in the cell, which was mighty convenient, I put a door in and locked it. I had decided that this was a pretty effective method, most likely, of dealing with unwanted prisoners. Wait for them to fall asleep, accidentally release the vampire from his chains, and criminal gone. Magical, even. Then all I needed to do was simply rearrest the vampire, and the cycle could continue. But no matter. Right now the vampire was in prison, and the were-creature was undoubtedly going to get snacked on eventually. So we had other things to work on, such as these bedrooms. As for the dwarves, the moods were still not great. Remember how I said I'd kind of bit off more than I could chew or was over-engineering these bedrooms? It's because they're kind of taking a long time to put together, so a lot of the dwarves don't even have a place to sleep. Thankfully, the food supply is at the very least varied, and these dwarves have nice big bricks of cheese. And as we were continuing construction, another forgotten beast emerged. This one had deadly blood and went by the name Godun. It was a skinless serpent with many horns. Unfortunately, this one actually had access to the fortress, so I had to prep what little military I had ready. The first dwarf to encounter it was Doran, the axe dwarf, alongside of Mini Monster, the leather worker, and overly enthusiastic Marks dwarf. Both of them were able to make a shockingly efficient escape, or they're just incredibly incompetent at actually finding the thing. At least until Doran, the axe dwarf, collided with it, and blood began to spray everywhere. And it didn't take long for the beast to bleed to death. Doran simply hacked it multiple times in places where it mattered, and the beast bled out. Unfortunately, Doran didn't survive the encounter, but probably saved the entire fortress in the process. Rest in peace, Doran. You were a good dwarf, and we'll be eating Danger Noodle for dinner. And I'm still anticipating some more deaths. so I had to expand the amount of coffins we had ready. And as the dwarves were placing bodies in tombs, more dwarves were found dead. Strange, what could possibly have happened? The beast was already dead. Well, it turns out that deadly blood was not, in fact, a lie. That deadly blood that beast had would cause you to bleed to death spontaneously. Well, that's unfortunate. The bodies continued to pile up. And as I was going through the process of expanding the coffins and realizing we had another strange mood that had just begun, preparing for another artifact, a dwarf was found dead. Tosid, one of my miners, completely drained of blood. All right, who let the vampire out early? Yep, that's our criminal. He's right there. In fact, he's reporting his own crime because he didn't just kill one dwarf. He actually killed two, Tosid and Orc with Bow. Edom, what a shame. I was going to give you that dwarf were-lizard as a snack, but I guess you just insist on taking other things early. That's rude. Even the goblins seem to agree, because they're trying to invade us. After convicting the vampire of their murder charges, they confessed to multiple crimes. I found this amusing because they had reported the crime that they had committed. But something occurred to me. While, yes, this was a vampire who, yes, confessed to a murder, they hadn't witnessed the original murder, and also weren't one of the witnesses in the original crime. And they had no memory of the initial death. Was the original crime committed by a different vampire? Had I found a second vampire? What else was happening here? I guess it's time to start digging through the old crimes because this is getting a bit absurd. At least after we finish killing these goblins. Fortunately, it was only a small scouting party, so the goblin threat fell rather quickly. Between the war dogs out front and the militia commander Jasper valiantly soloing the siege, the goblins were quickly vanquished, which just meant more cleanup for the rest of the dwarves. A true shame after all they've been through. Wintherthrone might need some restructuring. I was beginning to suspect that there was a non-zero chance that Dominoc, my captain of the guard, may actually be one of the vampires, so I decided to move him to the position of Hammerer and give his wife the position of captain of the guard. And we'd let her interrogate him and see what the result is. As this went on, turns out that my captain of the guard, Dominoc, was in fact not a vampire. But I kept the jobs as they were going forward, with Dominoc as the Hammerer and his wife as captain of the guard. I hoped the two of them would make a good team to track down criminals and the vampires that definitely were still lurking in the fortress, even though Solon had been locked up. Construction continued. I had the dwarves dig additional trenches for lava and prepared the beginnings of my new glass industry, because I was working on a library, a place where dwarves could properly study each and everything and aspect of the fortress, especially the cursed bloodsuckers who dwelled within the floors. And I say within the floors because I had plans for them, but those were plans that would have to wait, because more goblins had arrived, and this time they wished to discuss transfer of artifacts in the form of a parley. This is something the dwarves simply cannot allow. No goblin will ever find themselves in possession of our artifacts. So we welcome the goblins and the goblins enslaved dwarves to the tunnels beneath the entrance of the fortress, where Sakamura the mace dwarf led the attack, and the goblins' cursed marksmen failed to land a single bolt. The front lines of the dwarves bravely crashed through their pathetic excuse for an assault, and moved through the goblins like butter on a lava-soaked knife. As if they were forged in obsidian themselves, they crushed the goblin onslaught. The only slight threat to the dwarves was the dwarven invader himself. Flailing in a martial trance, he tried to take down his dwarven brethren, but quickly was bested. While some of the soldiers sustained injuries, losses were minimal, and only took the form of hospitalizations. The miners quickly moved to assist the injured dwarves, and only one dwarf was found dead in the process. But before the dwarves had the opportunity to even re-enter the fortress, the were-giraffe, Esmond, has come. A very large giraffe, twisted into humanoid form. Let's hope that the goose actually did its job this time. And fortunately enough, it did. The were-giraffe was rather far away, but unfortunately had encountered a single dwarf. The poor animal trainer was quickly shredded before the were-creature became a human once more, and moved out into the faraway lands on the edges of the fortress. Begone, vile human. May you rot in cold. Some seasons passed, and the interrogations continue. Construction on the dwarven library of glass and copper were continuing as scheduled. A single snail was beginning their studies, and pondered buttons that could be pressed. Same, honestly. I'm pondering that as I'm editing this video. The dwarves were busy, keeping themselves occupied preparing construction materials, clearing extra boulders, and starting fights in the tavern. Yeah, unfortunately, all of the interrogations and crimes that had been committed by the vampires, and of course the captain of the guard and his wife, had caused some unrest in the fortress, and this led to a few fights to break out. These, frankly, caused more injuries than the sieges. Teeth were lost, ears were removed, and noses were plucked in the midst of the tavern. Due to these brawls, I was forced to upgrade the hospital. While this was something I probably should have done sooner, the dwarves simply forced my hand, and the new hospital sat directly beneath the entry hall and just above the siege tunnels. Underneath the library, I began constructing a compartment, something I had a plan for, something the dwarves really needed to implement here, in order for things to take place as they should. Alongside of those tunnels that I began digging, our vampire was given tasks of his own. In fact, the vampire had been speaking with the captain of the guard and the dungeon master. The two of them had hitched a plan. They wanted to enlist the vampire as prisoner removal, in hopes that the vampire could help them locate other vampires in the fortress. And so the interrogations continued, and Solon, or Burr, the original arrested vampire, was released into some specific tunnels in the basement, and the interrogations continued. Even the mayor got interrogated. Frankly, there was no limits to who could get questioned. Construction continued in all parts of the fortress, and some more dwarves appeared dead, drained of blood. It seems the captain of the guard was getting a little bit careless with whether or not they kept their vampire imprisoned, and he'd wandered out and acquired a pickaxe. Funnily enough, the dwarves did quickly rearrest him, and during that arrest, more bodies were found, and this time it wasn't the original vampire, Solon, as he goes by, meaning my suspicions were true. There was in fact another vampire in the fortress, so the questioning must continue, and I was kind of at a loss as to who should be arrested, so I just continued constructing the fortress, and making space for my now trapped vampire. You see, we arrested him, and after he was arrested, we immediately released him, and he dug this small side channel. Our vampire now lives beneath the prison, serving his sentence, only to inevitably be released into the tunnels in the basement. These tunnels will connect with many facets of the fortress, allowing him to socialize and interact with the dwarves, as well as rid us of any unwanted prisoners. It was at this time that I had a bunch of migrants arrive, and they managed to arrive in a hole that was completely encased in ice. I'm gonna have to keep an eye on new migrants now, just to make sure they don't arrive and then starve to death because they can't actually enter the map properly. Let's hope this doesn't become a trend. Oh, and would you look at that? Another dwarf had been found dead, completely drained of blood. At this point, Solon the vampire had completely separated himself from the rest of the fortress and was living entirely down below. And it seems that we have found our culprit. Mincott, the animal caretaker, was seen killing somebody and was still actively concerned with it. We can see this down in her mental state. She doesn't feel anything at somebody's death and angry while killing somebody. Meaning, we found our second vampire, who has been in the fortress almost as long as the first, and in fact had direct memories of killing several of my dwarves, who I'd originally blamed on the other vampire. It's a grim reality, but one worth studying. Our new vampire was locked up and interrogated mercilessly. However, her mood and mental state wasn't as strong as Solon's, and she quickly deteriorated. Solon was still rather far away, working on his own fortress within the fortress, and the library was coming along well. Soon we'd be able to study these vampires and learn as much as we could about them, perhaps even write some books. Wintherthrone was beginning to take shape as a proper mountain home, and engravings of great thrones, embossed with images of volcanoes, were being scattered around the fortress. The dwarves assumed they didn't have long to wait until they became a mountain home, and were eagerly awaiting their king, or alternatively preparing to appoint one. The dwarves were making paper and preparing for their library, and the captain of the guard, now rather skilled, Onul, was continuing the interrogations, even though, by all counts, both of the vampires had been caught, because they had begun to develop a plan to properly control the fortress. Because what better way to study something is there than to simply become it? And the preparations began. As seasonal training came to an end, the vampires began their new life in the tunnels beneath the prison. Several other dwarves had been moved into the prison now, due to those fights that had been started in the tavern previously. Of course, they weren't too thrilled with their new reality. However, every dwarf needs to sleep eventually, and Solon the vampire waited patiently as the dwarves' ambitions grew. Structures were erected, near the invasion tunnels, with hopes and grand plans of new contraptions of death. And the soldiers, head up by Mini-Monster and Jasper, had begun invading goblin sites across the map. And as this progressed, the great shelves of magma made up the chair, and the back was a great volcano. Wintherthrone had become a true dwarven fortress, something to be envied by its peers. But they had a small problem. Right next door sat Winterhearth, a once thriving fortress of its own, now occupied by large goblin forces. That was why the dwarves had began the invasions. See, the thousands of goblins occupying Winterhearth would be no easy feat to destroy, so the dwarves were training to destroy these goblins that living in Winterhearth. In order for the dwarves to take back what was rightfully theirs and restore peace to the region, these goblins must fall. But even armies of tens, if not hundreds of dwarves, would take years to be able to successfully destroy a goblin fortress such as this. And that was what the studies were for. The scholars in the library had learned many things about the vampires that dwelled in the tunnels, consuming the prisoners. They never got tired, required less food for nourishment, and seemingly lost the ability to age. Intrigued, they hoped to experiment with these new discoveries and constructed a well nearby the tavern. Beneath the well, they constructed an upright spear. The logic was that if the spear penetrated a vampire, a piece of the vampire would float in the well. And perhaps if a dwarf washed themselves or drank from said well, just like the deadly blood from several years ago, the dwarves would become that which they ate. In the case here, if a dwarf consumes vampire blood, they become a vampire. In order for this to happen, several heavy bleeding wounds must be inflicted on the vampire. This creates a pool of blood where the vampire stands. If the blood is mixed with water that is more than 3 levels deep out of 7, and a dwarf drinks the blood and water, they are converted immediately to a vampire. Now, I'm sure one or more of you in the audience are saying, I remember this from another Dwarf Fortress series called Honeystoker, and this is my moment to recommend that you go watch Honeystoker after this video. The full series by Krugsmash. I'll link episode 1 in the description below. But this method of transforming other dwarves into vampires has been around for quite some time. The most challenging portion of the task is actually getting the vampire to stay in one place. But after several attempts and a lot of buckets of water, the dwarves were able to convince Solon to not jump out of the well again and instead stand in the room. And they finally had enough time, as he sat there and pondered, to impale him repeatedly with the lever and the spike. After that, when I hover my mouse directly over the tile with the vampire, you can clearly see a pool of Solon's blood directly underneath the vampire. The final thing that needs to be done is dwarves need to be locked in the room with the well, without any access to alcohol. And then after that, it was just a matter of time before Dalmonok the Hammerer, the first dwarf to ingest the vampire blood and become a vampire. Onul, his wife, would soon follow. The corruption had begun. They took the few of their most trusted, who quickly joined them, as well as the military. Their thirst would become unquenchable for blood, but their lives would be extended. Fortress Wintherthrone was beginning to take shape. The invasions were only just beginning. The first well and spear was a success. They now needed to perfect the form of transformation for any new dwarves who wish to turn. And if they don't, well, then they will simply be used as a form of nourishment. I would like to inform you that this beautiful artwork that you are seeing on the screen right now is available in the format of mug and sticker on my merch store. If you'd like to help keep these videos funded and free of corporate sponsorship, you could theoretically purchase a mug, or alternatively check out the YouTube channel where the VODs for these streams are archived and go give them a view. This video itself has been edited out of 500 gigabytes of footage, and all of the 17 parts are available on my second YouTube channel. Of course, they were also streamed live at twitch.tv/BLINDIRL. Now that we're through the obligatory self-promotion moment, let's get back into the video. The dwarves quickly perfected the system with a lever nearby the spike pit, with trapdoors to block and a set of grates just above where the culprit or volunteer will be placed, making the scrambling away more challenging. Still possible, but more challenging. Soon after, the spear was installed, and the dwarves got to work hooking it up to the lever with a set of mechanisms. Now they just needed a volunteer. Somebody brave. Edict was selected for having the shortest beard. No offense, really. It's just simply the dwarven way of doing things. The rest of the dwarves were instructed to fill this strange well, which they thought was curious, for they already had a very effective one in the hospital. Why did they need more? And why isn't the captain of the guard concerned with these murders that seemingly keep happening? Little did they know it was likely the captain of the guard herself. But since they obeyed orders, the dwarves continued expanding the coffins. The level of morale in the fortress was pretty stable, all things considered, but rapidly dropping, especially for Edict here, who had been placed naked in a well above a grate, and then dropped like a dunk tank in a fairground into the well itself, onto a spike. Distressed by this predicament, Edict promptly scrambled out, only to be ordered once again to stand on the dunk tank. The dwarves then dropped him once again, and he climbed back up, much to the dwarves' dismay. But maybe third time's the charm. The dwarves dropped them once again. The newly minted vampire was hopefully ready to be stabbed repeatedly with a spike, and so the dwarves pulled the lever. But somehow, Edict had climbed out, once again. Well, that's perplexing. I'm not sure how this dwarf is continuously doing this, but no matter. We'll just find someone else. The dwarves selected Ole, the warthog man. Ole, unfortunately, had had some serious leg injuries earlier in life and couldn't walk properly. The vampires presumed this would affect his ability to climb, and they were correct. The first lever stabbed swiftly, inflicting heavy bleeding. The second impact broke and destroyed both of his legs, and the third crushed his lungs. Fortunately, vampires do not need oxygen, so Ole now lay in the well, unable to breathe, move their hands, or stand, and the lever continued to stab. The remainder of the military dwarves, who had not been turned, were standing above the well, next to the newly converted militia captains, who were instructing their dwarves to drink. One dwarf refused to comply, and that matter was sorted. As soon as the dwarf got drowsy, their life was ended. Such is the price for insubordination, and they could hear the cries of the warthog man as far away as the tavern, but the dwarves were still instructed to top off this strange well, and probably were beginning to suspect that something was amiss. But the militia was turning, losing the ability to become tired or exhausted in combat. This was the strongest dwarven military to exist in the world, and the goblins were still dumb enough to find out how strong these dwarves are. They attempted to invade Wintherthrone once again. The dwarves expected bodies, but not from the goblins. The dwarves were expecting bodies because many of the vampires were now scattered throughout the fortress, and some of them were bound to become thirsty. The goblins slowly moved through the entry halls, seeing spots of lava from experiments of destruction that they do not even know the scale of. The first few scouts encounter the vampires and are swiftly sliced to shreds. Soon after, the remaining few goblins are met with a similar fate, and the final thieves who thought they would kidnap some dwarven children and save them from this monstrous uprising were also executed. Long live Wintherthrone, dwarves. May the invasion of the goblin territories begin. The conversions continued for the few remaining militia, and the civilians were next to follow. And as the process continued, converting the dwarves behind the scenes, the militia had begun invading Winterhearth. It was a necessity that they reclaim the valuable mines that founded this fortress. And as the years went by, the goblins continued to invade, and the dwarves continued to turn them into smears of red. The civilians slowly converted, and those that didn't were consumed, and murder was no longer considered murder by the militia captain. It was simply a necessity for continued existence. Even the children were a potential risk if they did not drink from the fountain of life. So now what? Honestly, that's a good question. I have a fortress that's rapidly becoming full of vampires, and I wanted to have fun with it. So it was at this point that I decided it was time to ramp up the invasions and try to take back Wintherthrone. I mean, it had about 2,000 goblins in it at this point. I also realized that in order to actually keep this fortress sane, as you can see the moods are beginning to drop, I had to take some drastic measures. I needed a better method of cleaning up bodies, so I built a very large lava reservoir, and this contraption, which I'll talk about a little later in the video. To fill the lava, I simply pumped it out of the previous reservoir, using power from above that we constructed earlier. And oh man, would you look at that? Another dead dwarf. How unfortunate. Well, that's what you get for not drinking the Kool-Aid. And honestly, at this point, it's mostly just an inevitability. The dwarves are going to get hungry and they're going to need to eat. When they eat, dwarves are going to die. At least until we run out of dwarves to eat. And then we're going to start having problems. The moods are going to get worse, and we're going to have to overly compensate for their lack of sanity by giving them alternative means of happiness, such as keeping them busy, praying, socializing, and forcing them to drink alcohol in a tavern. And actually, that's something else I need to talk about. Vampires won't drink alcohol of their own accord, but they do still need it. Otherwise, dwarves will go nuts, vampire or not. So in order to combat this, I have to have tavern keepers. Tavern keepers serve alcohol to everybody in the tavern. And because vampires will not go and get alcohol themselves, I'm required to use tavern keepers. And while they make their rounds to and from the chests that are full of mugs in the tavern and the alcohol stockpile, serving the lovely, lovely brewed beverages, this presents a problem. Dwarves can actually get drunk. Now, while they do need alcohol to survive, if they drink too much alcohol, they begin to brawl, hence the injuries from earlier. So in order to keep these dwarves sane, they need to go to the tavern. They need to spend time in the tavern and drink lots of alcohol. But whenever they drink slightly too much alcohol, it starts a big fight. So we're going to have to massively overcompensate for these negative moods to keep the fortress even remotely stable. There's also the other problem, which is we keep getting migrants. So they get jammed into the isolation room and forced to drink well water, once we fill it up, of course. And then anybody who takes too long and falls asleep gets promptly consumed. The invasions were beginning to pick up and honestly going quite well. Whenever they would re-enter the map, I would immediately make them re-leave the map, and this went on for quite some time. Construction was a way to keep dwarves entertained, however, if I kept them too busy, then they would slowly get upset, having not had alcohol or taken care of themselves. They also didn't get the normal happy thoughts such as slept in a bedroom because they're vampires, and they don't need to sleep. Forgotten beasts kept on showing up, and this one got into the caverns, did a little bit of damage, but thankfully the dwarves were quite well equipped, and soldiers were able to come to their aid quickly. Unfortunately, several of my soldiers fell here, thus more bodies to clean up. Time to expand the coffins once more, and continue invading the goblins. Due to the sheer numbers of goblins that had occupied my previous fortress, I actually started losing some dwarves in the actual sieges, which I was quite surprised to see. Thankfully, we won't have to clean up as many bodies when the goblins attack us, because my pumping setup was nearing completion, and any enemies could simply have lava dumped on their head. Sieges continued, some better, some worse, and I was continuing the necessary additions to the hospital, including my lovely spike cross. We'd also acquired a baby vampire. Now this is just mildly disturbing. This vampire will never age, so thus it will maintain its age of baby for its entire life. Its mother dropped it after about a year, but is still alive and running around. And this baby is now a vampire who is going to wander in circles, being immortal forever. And frankly, I find this quite disturbing. At least it's not dead though, otherwise it would have been a quick snack for some other dwarf. At this point, I was keeping the entire population vampirized, and so it was just a matter of witnessing small mistakes happen, because seemingly whenever the moods went up, something bad happened. Be that a forgotten beast, dwarves lost in a poor siege attempt, or this stupid fruit bat that could breathe fire. It's a shame it's not a vampire bat. This was a gross miscalculation on my part. I thought I'd already locked the surface doors, and just kind of resigned all the dwarves that were underground to inevitable death. I knew I would lose some, but frankly I figured if they got completely torched, at the very least, all I'd have to do is memorialize them, and the mood impact wouldn't be too negative. After it finished, completely obliterating all of my livestock and the dwarves underground, it slipped through the first doorway. I figured there was somebody left in the stairwell, until it popped through my upper stairs, and out the door. I swear that I locked these. Too late now, I suppose. Most of my soldiers were quite far away. They had just been heading out for a siege, so I had to turn them around. The fruit bat quickly filled the hallways up with smoke, completely eviscerating any line of sight, stopping the dwarves from being able to pass through it. A couple of dwarves quickly fell, including one blocking the doorway to the manager's office. But there was hope. All I needed to do was wait for it to get into an isolated area and lock the door. Best I could hope for is that it would move into one of my bedroom clusters. And it did. And while it did quite horribly murder every dwarf that happened to be in that little temple at the time, thankfully, It was isolated. At least now it's easy to dispose of. I can drop a rock on it or stick it in a separate room, something of that sort. I ended up locking it in one of the old vampire hallways beneath the fortress, hoping I could do something with it later. Because being optimistic was something I had to get used to in this fortress. Managing vampires, turns out, is very difficult. Even though they still have some resemblance to dwarves, it really feels like I'm playing something else. It no longer feels like Dwarf Fortress. I mean, this certainly looks like a dwarven helm, and this definitely looks like a dwarven invasion, but the process of playing this fort has become something else entirely. At this point, I just needed to deal with dwarves that had began tantruming. So I was interrogating them. To give you an idea on what I was trying to do here, I wasn't just trying to arrest dwarves. I wanted them to die. A number of the dwarves had become so distraught with all of the constant sieges that they were just tantruming constantly. And it turns out the easiest way to get rid of a dwarf that doesn't stop tantruming is accuse them of a whole bunch of murders they didn't commit and have the captain of the guard simply punch them so hard in their head that their head explodes. The system was quite effective. I took full advantage of it. I also tried to improve the fortress in any way that I could to help make those moods improve, even just slightly. This may also seem counterproductive, but I also put some of the more upset dwarves into the squads, because they would just be leaving the map constantly and hopefully not be able to cause any problems upon returning, as I would just make them leave again immediately. And whenever new migrants arrived, I swiftly made them drink the Kool-Aid, lest they be eaten by the hungry vampires. At which point they then would join the military because they had all of their functioning limbs. Because that's something I should probably talk about. Normal dwarves can withstand quite a good deal of physical trauma. But that's nothing compared to vampires, because vampires don't need to eat or drink or breathe. They can lose their lungs and many other internal organs that would kill a dwarf. However, this does impact their ability to move, stand, and function properly. And something that I was noticing more and more is no matter how good my doctors were, some of my dwarves were getting maimed and surviving and continuing to try and function and getting worse at everything. So the newbies always went directly into the military and out into the sieging front. Because if we weren't attacking them, they would then turn around and attack us. And the days of small goblin assaults were long past, and their numbers had gotten rather staggering. This army of beak dogs, goblins, ogres, trolls, Maneras, and cave dragons numbered in the high hundreds, and they walked through my still very unfinished contraption, I will talk about that later, and into the heated floor room. I'm sure they liked the warm ambience. As they moved around the corner, the dwarves would then go through the operations of closing the gates. All of this was happening while the majority of my soldiers weren't even here. They would then pull a few switches and flip some levers, and the flamin' hot Cheeto dust would engulf them. This would stop me from having to manually clean up any bodies and increase the goblinite supply, which we would then melt down, because iron is lava safe. Even though the copper melts away, it's not a huge loss. However, not all of the sieges went so smoothly. This rather unassuming little skirmish sent in by the goblins managed to get through my defenses, because I was dumb and forgot to lock this drawbridge, which of course granted them access to my maintenance tunnels. The bodies of this one were quite severe and the cleanup was pretty gnarly. Thankfully there wasn't that many goblins. And of course you would presume that I would remember to close all of my doors and not let such a mistake happen again. Which of course is true, and I definitely don't make any mistakes in any fortresses ever. Don't watch until the end of the video. Where was I? Right, contraptions. I was trying to get the lower entrance of the fortress, which was becoming my defensive structure, to a point where I was happy with it. And let me just really quickly talk about the theory of what I'm constructing here. This is a circular minecart grinder. The idea is you get a minecart going really, really fast, and then when it collides with an unfortunate soul, it has more or less the same effect as hitting a groundhog with a semi-truck. If the impact of the minecart doesn't kill them, then slamming into the wall certainly will. To make matters more effective, the lower level, beneath where these minecarts are, is going to be filled up with lava, so that when they drop down into the lava, it fills the minecarts up with them. Ideally, they would occasionally dump out the lava, which may happen when they come to a sudden stop. But more likely what'll happen is it'll just make the minecarts a lot heavier, which of course will make the damage on impact caused by the minecarts that much more intense. Because what's scarier than a school bus driving directly towards you at maximum speed? Well, clearly a school bus driving towards you at maximum speed, filled with 750 of the world's heaviest sumo wrestlers. It was one of those seasons again. My squads were leaving and coming and going repeatedly and invading the goblins, and every other dwarf was staying at home, locked in the tavern, and being served booze by one of the many tavern keepers. In theory, a dwarven paradise. In reality, they all hate it here. The volcano of Wintherthrone was still erupting, and I would still be hearing that little sound of the blip alert if I hadn't turned it off so long ago. Instead, I only heard it when a dwarf went berserk and killed a bunch of dwarves, or sheep or whatever, like what happened here. This dwarf specifically wanted crystal glass, and I had forgotten or hadn't thought of importing any, so they went insane and killed a bunch of dwarves, a sheep, and tried to kill a child. But sometimes the most satisfying things in Dwarf Fortress are when you get to unironically say,
What's it say?
Well, it says, I love it when a plan comes together.
and this was one of those moments. My machine was more or less ready to go, and the dwarves were getting a little bit of much-needed respite. The R&R was, of course, vital, because if any dwarf decided to exit the fortress at this moment, well, they might just be turned into red paste. Because our test run was extremely successful, and it was just in the nick of time. Because the goblins were about to make it clear that they had had enough of me, and I don't think it was because I stole their giant saltwater crocodile. I think it was because we kept invading every single one of their home locations. But this was one of those glorious moments where I get to witness my 10 plus hours of real-time construction functioning flawlessly. The minecarts worked as intended, slamming the goblins into walls, and moved effortlessly through the crowds of beak dogs. That blood that's appearing on the ground, that's probably from crushed limbs mostly, and the minecarts are likely moving at 80 plus miles an hour. Of course, I had to get a better view, so I decided to follow one of the minecarts in particular. Oddly enough, this wasn't even at full operation. I didn't quite have enough lava in the reservoir to fill it, and eventually the minecarts would come to a halt. Turns out larger creatures like ogres actually operate as pretty effective minecart stopping devices, which of course means it was time to line up the dwarves to defend the exit before we dump the lava on their heads. And because I definitely don't make any mistakes, I definitely didn't line my dwarves up too close to the entrance. And one of my dwarves didn't go a little bonkers and decide to wander around obliviously. And absolutely did not wander directly. I had a dwarf that wandered directly into the enemy army. Now, this dwarf, Kubok here, was one of my best military dwarves. Had hundreds of kills to her name, and had survived in the fortress for almost the entire length of it. So while she is wandering around obliviously, the goblins are completely incapable of actually hitting her, and she is dodging every single attack as if it didn't even exist. Honestly, kind of an impressive feat that she was able to live and survive this siege as long as she did. I was just wondering if I should attempt to save her, and absent-mindedly, I opted to let the dwarves attempt to rescue her. This was that mistake that I was hinting at, because while yes, they did run in, they didn't rescue her. The additional dwarven vampires in the fray just increased the amount of chaos as smoke began to plume from a goblin that burned to death. It was just a matter of time before every single one of those soldiers fell. And that was all of the soldiers that I had in waiting to defend the fortress. I also forgot to close the gate while the soldiers were fighting. And so a stream of goblins began pouring into the fortress, which was currently underarmed and overbloated with hubris. And while yes, I did get the gate shut a few moments later, a few dozen goblins had already entered the fortress and streamed into my main crafting rooms. They ran in and executed a few of my original adventurers, and then moved into the entry hall of the fortress proper. Thankfully, I had had the foresight to keep some of the war dragons around, just as possible defenders of the fortress, and I did have a couple of very malnourished, injured, damaged, beaten up, bludgeoned soldiers left that mostly couldn't walk, but were able to fend off the fortress, and with a lot of effort, my vampires were eventually able to fight back the onslaught of goblin insurgents, but it took extreme losses for the dwarves to complete such a task. And as the fighting died down, the vampires gave up a majority of the hope that they had left, and doused the goblin hordes in molten lava. I think it goes without saying that I had a lot of fun with this fortress. Eventually, I was able to retake Wintherthrone from the goblins. It took about 5 years of in-game time, and I attacked it about 6 times per season with my various squads. But the fortress was a lot of fun, similarly to how these vampires are having fun with this surface titan, and turning it into a husk of what it once was. Managing vampires in Dwarf Fortress have some pros and cons. The save file for this fortress is available. You can download it. There's a link down below. Go download it. It's the DFFD download link. So if you would like to try managing these dwarves for yourself, I encourage you to give it a try. by simply downloading the save file, extracting it from the zipped file, and then putting it in the save directory of your Dwarf Fortress install, and then enjoy these vampires to your heart's content. So let's start off with the pros. The pros of managing a fortress of vampires is they don't need to eat, drink, or sleep. So thus you don't need bedrooms, you don't need to produce alcohol, and you also don't need to produce food. They're also very strong, get massive perks in combat, and because they're inexhaustible, they're almost invincible in a fair fight. However, the cons. They're immortal and don't do a lot of things that make dwarves happy, making their moods a lot harder to manage. As you can see, as the time went on in this fortress, I inevitably had to cover it in mist generators. Dwarves would sustain uncurable injuries, which made selecting new military dwarves a challenge, and also made managing their moods even more difficult. Because they didn't use their bedrooms, they would just leave their clothing lying around everywhere, instead of putting their clothes away in their cabinets. And of course, the lack of aging makes vampire children even less useful than they would be normally. While running a vampire fortress, for me, is something that I found to be very entertaining, especially in a one-off fortress like this, kind of as an experiment. But to be completely honest with you, I ended this fortress not because I needed to, but because I was simply tired of playing it. The gimmick had run its course and I'd seen everything I needed to, and it was starting to feel like I was that adventurer at the bottom of the well, getting repeatedly stabbed with a spear. So I decided to retire it, after I found some demons, of course. Once again, if you'd like to try out this save file and this fortress for yourself, help this eternal fortress live on. Share your stories below of vampires and things that you've encountered in Dwarf Fortress. And if you play this fortress to greater success than I would love to know your outcome for this story. Because no matter who sits on the throne, winter is eternal, and these dwarves are immortal and shall prosper forever. Long live Wintherthrone on the obsidian shelves, for all living beings will feel the terror of those who seek the taste of blood. Thank you very much for watching this video. Once again, just like my last one, which was much moister than this one, some additional songs were provided by the Croatian folk band Flotnar. I'll link to their channel in the description as well. I realize there's a lot of links down there and it's probably getting busy, but do check them out. Their music's pretty cool. Also, if you haven't yet, please purchase a mug. At this point, they just go to help paying my mortgage, so it's kind of a big deal for me. This one is limited edition and will be hidden from my main merch store at a point, but you can always find it through the link in the description of this video. The cool art in this video was provided by a combination of Goblin Art and Cooler_SK, if you'd like to commission something from one of them. And I will continue editing videos like this until you stop watching them, so if you'd like to see more, please leave a comment underneath this video. That includes the word blood. I'm sure we'll keep out of trouble with that one. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Unless the vampires get to you first. Pum pum. Pum pum.